Good evening and welcome to the third installment of the AUA's Advanced Prostate Cancer Clinical Trial Research webinar series, Running and Succeeding in Your Advanced Prostate Cancer Clinical Trial, live virtual course. We strive to offer outstanding educational courses and greatly appreciate your evaluations and general feedback so we can continuously improve our programs. The AUA is accredited by the ACCME and designates this live activity for a maximum of 1.0 AMA PRA Category 1 credits. Evaluations are very important to us. Course evaluations and CME credits will be administered electronically on AUA University immediately following the course. As we at the AUA continue to develop virtual education that meets your needs, we especially welcome your feedback regarding both the content and format following the program. Please stay tuned for a keyword that will be provided during the webinar. The keyword is used to verify your participation in the webinar. You will need to use this keyword to access the course evaluation, CME credit claim, and certificate. All persons in a position to control the content of a CME activity are required to disclose to the AUA as the ACCME accredited provider all financial relationships with any ineligible company, formerly commercial interests, during the previous 24 months. An ineligible company is defined as one whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. The AUA must determine if the individual's relationships are relevant to the educational activity. The intent of this disclosure is not to prevent individuals with relevant financial relationships from participating, but rather to provide learners with information so they can make their own judgments. You are prohibited from using or uploading content you access through this activity into external applications, bots, software, or websites, including those using artificial intelligence technologies and infrastructure, including deep learning, machine learning, and large language models and generative AI. This educational activity is conducted in support of the objectives of the AUA Clinical Trials Collective, and the AUA would like to thank Chesapeake Urology Associates for the support provided to the Urology Care Foundation Endowment Fund to support this educational activity. We hope that you will actively participate as you connect and learn from each other during the course. Due to the size of the audience, all participants will be listen-only mode without video, but we encourage you to ask questions. Feel free to ask questions of the experts during this time using the Zoom chat box at the bottom of your screen. Get social with the AUA. Share your highlights from the AUA virtual experience with the global urology community online. Tag us at American Urological or use the hashtag AUA University. Finally, I'd like to introduce and extend a special thank you to our course director, Dr. Todd Morgan. Todd Morgan is the Jack Lapide's Research Professor of Urology and Section Head of Urologic Oncology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I will now turn the course over to Dr. Morgan.
Hey, thanks so much, Angie. This is our last of our three-part webinar series. This is our hat trick, and it really has been a great series so far. And if you haven't listened to the first two webinars, keep listening and keep watching, and then go back and listen to the other ones later. They are really educational. I learned a lot from both of those. And the setup for these webinars is the first one was like getting ready. We're going to get ready to run a clinical trial. Again, the focus here is on advanced prostate cancer, but that's really kind of the example case to learn about clinical trials. And so the first webinar, we talked a lot about just the very basics of how you might get ready to see whether your site can run a trial. And then the second one is doing the setup and thinking about all the ways that we get set to run a clinical trial at our sites. And this webinar is going to focus on the launch period. We're ready to go. And once that trial is activated, how do we run that trial successfully? We're really lucky to have great faculty. And I'm going to get to introduce those faculty in a second. I need to get my screen share swapped over here. So first, I want to cover the activity goal. Here, the goal is to help urologists gain expertise in the conduct of high-quality trials, from enrollment and oversight to data integrity reporting and dissemination. Again, it's really about actively running our trials. In terms of the learning objectives, the first is to implement targeted recruitment and retention strategies to meet enrollment goals while maintaining patient satisfaction. Second, to ensure ongoing protocol adherence and effective oversight, integrating research procedures seamlessly with clinical care. Third, we want to maintain standards of data integrity, audit readiness, and regulatory compliance. And fourth objective is to demonstrate strong site performance through outcomes assessment, scholarly dissemination, and operational excellence to enhance desirability for future trials. That's a lot to cover. We're just incredibly fortunate to have two expert faculty here, Heather Chang and Scott Delacroix. Heather is professor, Division of Hematology and Oncology at the University of Washington. She's the director of the Prostate Cancer Genetics Clinic at Fred Hutch. Thank you, Heather. I should mention Heather's just an incredible expert, not just in genetics, but in clinical trials in prostate cancer medical oncology. Really kind of you as a medical oncologist to come over and help us with our AUA clinical trials series. Appreciate having you here. Also here is Scott Delacroix. Scott is medical director of urologic oncology and GU cancers at the Mary Bird Perkins Cancer Center in New Orleans. I guess in Metairie, which I think is part of New Orleans. Is that right,
It's a
Scott?
suburb. It's a
Suburb. There you
suburb.
go.
It's five
Okay.
five
You're
minutes outside.
well, yeah, so in New Orleans. Scott, in addition to being an expert urologic oncologist, is really kind of the North Star for me in many ways of somebody who is incredibly successful at running clinical trials, designing clinical trials at all aspects of the clinical trials process. So very grateful to have you here and to get to learn from you.
Well, thank you very much, Todd, and organizers for inviting us.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
pleasure to be here.
great to have you guys here. So the we jump in. The first topic is it's kind of it's in the weeds, but this is I think it's probably appropriate that this is we open a trial and we're like so excited that this trial that we've been working on for years is activated at our site, and the reality sets in. Okay, we got to recruit patients, and oh, by the way, there's like a lot of technical stuff to this, and that's a lot of I think what we want to cover here in this webinar is some of the technicalities which are challenging, are important, and non-trivial. And so the question I have for you guys is when you are the site PI on a study, what issues have you seen arise and what strategies do you use to maintain protocol adherence? Because this is obviously fundamental to the study. I mean, just little deviations create massive headaches. But Scott, maybe I'll start with you, and we've pulled out a trial, the SWOG 1802 trial, maybe to help give you some substance to talk about here.
Sure. I mean, the step one is to make sure you're opening up the right trial. So we'll take it as given that you've looked at your practice, you've looked at the patients that come through your clinic, and that you're opening a trial with patients that you see frequently and that you're familiar treating. So beyond that, every trial has its own idiosyncrasies. Every trial, especially some of these older trials, they're not as pragmatic as some of the newer trials. The NCI now has pushed a whole pragmatic design and trial design. So that way we're not doing PROs and labs at weird times to try to make it more gentle for the patients on trial. So one of the biggest things is to go through and what I call whiteboarding a trial. So you look at the trial, you're gonna open it up, and then we sit with our research nurses and we look at every visit and every inclusion criteria and every exclusion criteria and figure out where are our pitfalls? What do we have to know? How could we potentially put an ineligible patient on? It may be buried in a line that says patient could not have been on 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. And if you don't read that one line, you may enroll in an ineligible patient. So step one is really to read the trial, but also whiteboard it. Put it on a big whiteboard and look at all of your timelines. As you're doing that, for me, that's how I'm sitting there and figuring out how am I going to explain this trial to a patient. You really need to know the trial. It becomes difficult when you have urology colleagues who say, "Oh, I saw you put 5 patients on that trial. I want to put one on." You have to realize that's the first patient that investigator's putting on, and you might have to go hold their hands. So, so like when we look at 1802, 1802 was pragmatic in some ways, but also a little bit complicated in that there's a two-step enrollment, and you can do step one at the time of diagnosis. You can then do step two after 6 months of ADT and then truly randomize. Or patients can just show up after having 6 months of ADT. And if they want to go on trial, you can do step one and two together and put them on trial and randomize them between standard systemic therapy or local therapy. Why this was done in this trial is Dr. Chapin wanted to, and Dr. Aparicio, the two PIs in this study, they really wanted to get correlative banking going. And there are going to be some things, and there are going to be correlatives that are built into this that I think are equally as important as the treatment arms. It's really important to inform our next trials by making sure that we participate not only in putting a patient on a trial, but trying to get those correlatives. And so all of those things need to be built out when you whiteboard the trial. It's a long answer, but
Great answer. Great answer. Heather, what do you think? I mean, these are tough problems, and sometimes you're maybe it's not a trial that you wrote, you're the site PI, and so you don't know it quite as well as you would if you wrote the trial, but you're responsible for answering these questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important that to think about, everybody and every site has different resources and it's a team effort. And we really, in my group at the Hutch, we and Fred and UW, and especially when there's multiple disciplines, I think we can't all sort of know. In all cases, it's of course ideal if you know all the details, but sometimes it's also about setting your systems up. And so we, for example, have checklists. So as you go through the trial, like Scott was just saying, you can create a checklist, and that then is easier for handoffs to other coordinators. Sometimes they cover for each other at holiday times, or then it's easier because then it's a systematic way to say, what are the things we need to be thinking about? What are the inclusion criteria? What are the exclusion criteria? And you can go through it line by line. And I think that can really be also a source that can be helpful for if sometimes there can be some areas where there's not complete clarity, or the wording is a little bit confusing and you don't realize it till you're actually there with the patient. And then it gives you a backbone to say, okay, now we're going to change the checklist. So the next time we go through the process with the next patient, then now the whole team kind of knows what to do, and how to sort of interpret that line of eligibility. So I think that thinking about that as a team effort, and sometimes I don't know. I mean, we run so many trials, both in the sort of multidisciplinary space, but also in the advanced disease space. We have phase one trials. And I just have to say, sometimes I don't know all the details, but we can figure out who does. The other thing that can be really helpful is just as you're doing study startup, and Scott mentioned this too, it's really helpful to think about, are you seeing those patients? But then how are you going to find those patients? At what point in the process would your team be able to identify those patients? Sometimes it's a research nurse who's going through the clinic schedule the day before. That can be really helpful, looking with an eye to who's eligible for what trial. What we do is we go through everyone, all the attendings in our group, our schedules. We just go through pretty quickly all our schedules for the next week and say who's getting restaging scans, who might be eligible for trial, and then can we focus on those people and figure out what trials they might be, eligible for, and then you've got a little bit of a head start before you're in clinic. So any
Yeah.
time you can do that before they're actually in clinic gives you more time to prepare, to think about sort of, can you send it in advance? Do you think this patient might be amenable to that? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, but the earlier you can kind of, be having the trial in mind, I think the more successful the process can go.
Yeah, I love that. And we've got a little segment on enrollment. And so I want to put a pin in that and circle back because that's so important. And I want to learn how you in medical oncology approach this. But when, like, your experience running trials and dealing with these ambiguous cases that come up, which happens more often yeah, I think many would think, but certainly I didn't realize how often we come into these scenarios where it's like just not totally apparent from the protocol what the right thing is. How has that informed how you write trials?
Well, I think it's a really excellent point because I think it's true across, maybe just in medicine in general or just human communication. Like the intention of one person's expression of something can be received differently, and we don't always know that until you sort of test it, right? You stress test it. You can tell patients something and they nod their head and it seems like everyone's on the same page. But then if you were to ask them, 30 minutes later what was actually said, it may not have been the message that was intended. So I think that's why checklists can be helpful. And then handoffs can, what's your understanding? Like when you write the protocol, have the coordinator do the whiteboarding or the checklist and then see, does it match? And are there areas of confusion? If so, that would be a great time to check in with the PI if there is, a study team. But that's something that can be iterative. And I think that, the process of going through the IRB, the sort of, vetting with your groups, all of that is, I think, can be sometimes cumbersome and feel frustrating, but the good side is it gives you the opportunity to figure out what those sort of points of potential confusion might be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, I mean, it's painful. I'm not advocating for all that pain, but a little of that pain is definitely worthwhile in figuring out, oh, well, we wrote that and it's just that's gonna miss the mark. And people aren't going to totally understand, or there's more patients in that group than we really intend there to be.
Yeah.
Um, and so thanks for that point. So, um, fine. So we've thought about protocol adherence. Now we've really got to think about data integrity. We obviously need high quality data. That's the foundation of what we're going to build our findings from any trial on. And so yeah, I just, I would bring this up because early on, I didn't realize the extent to which the PI truly is responsible for this, at least at some level, ensuring oversight over all the data. And so I guess I'd ask you how, like, to what extent is this the PI's responsibility, and how do you deal with making sure that your team is collecting quality data, um, and then when you get ready for like an audit, what does that look like? Heather, I don't know if you want to start with this one.
Yeah, I can start with this. Yeah. So again, I think checklists can be your friend. We have case report forms that are standardized that get developed in advance when you're designing the trial, and most studies have that. And I think that's really helpful for, trying to standardize the data, making sure that the team is staying up to date on that. And then we do internal audits, before sort of official external audits when we can. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes not. And then it really is, I think, again, a team effort, and mistakes can happen, and that's normal. And I think the key is to normalize, is not to sort of put blame, but to say, how can the system be more robust to avoid this from happening? And not to say, oh, it's, you misinterpreted this, but this is a confusing sort of question. How can we make it clearer so that everyone can do better? And I think that's generally the spirit of trials, is not to necessarily get it perfect, expect that you're going to get great at if you do, but sometimes it's not uncommon for there just to be little hiccups along the way. And as long as you're working to try to improve that, I think our sort of external auditors and our IRBs and all the other people that are looking over the shoulder to make sure we're doing right by way of the research and the patients are also invested in just making sure that the general team is there to try to improve the data and do right by the patients. And if there's that sense that the team is doing that, then I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we see these trials published in New England Journal and JAMA, the JCO, I mean, we want to believe that these are like perfectly collected data, and patients are supposed to have 3 months follow-up, every 3 month follow-up, and that's happening for everybody, and all the data are being entered perfectly. But eh, that's in reality not always the case. And it's really hard to execute on that. And so we do find issues that come up. I don't know, Scott, have you experienced this where you've had audits or internal QC checks where you've found issues?
Of course. I mean, anyone who does clinical trials, if they say no, then they're lying. So of course, yeah, because it's a constant improvement, and every trial is a little different. Some trials are written very poorly. Some trials are written very well. And not every audit is a for-cause audit. A lot of the NCTN research bases, they'll just come audit you on a regular basis. Uh, those tend to be pretty benign. I mean, the biggest thing that you want to make sure that you don't is put an ineligible patient on trial. And realize that not every protocol deviation, is a death nail. There may be a patient, I'm thinking of a bladder cancer trial like 1806, so bladder cancer chemoradiation trial. Some of those patients are 3 years out, 4 years out. They're meant to be followed for 5 years. Got some patients who are 90 years old, and they're not technically off trial until they hit that 5-year point. And they call and say, look, I've moved into a nursing home with my husband. I don't want to come get my CT scan and my cysto. Okay, I'm fine with that. But we need to make sure we document it. So we go into the chart, talk to the patient. They're refusing. We're not going to take them off of trial because that means their data can't be utilized for an endpoint assessment. We're going to document appropriately the reason why we're going to have a follow-up protocol deviation. Because the patient's 91 and they don't drive and they can't come in for their CT scan. Okay, wonderful. So that's much different than putting an ineligible patient on trial in the upfront setting. I think from a pharma standpoint, it tends to be a lot more ongoing. So if you're getting an audit of a pharma trial, you're probably having the FDA come in, and that's a big deal.
Right.
If the FDA is coming in, because that's like having an IRS audit. That's like not a good thing. But pharma is pretty much an industry is pretty much on top of all their data as it's coming in. And then the other thing is, regardless of what type of trial you're doing, I guess this excludes the IIT. If you're doing an external trial with a national PI or a national team, just pick up the phone or send an email. There's an email and there's a PI, and then there's below the PI, there's sub-Is. And then below that, there's going to be like a research team at NRG or at SWOG. Just send an email asking a question. I'm sure you'll get an email back. And if you put your cell phone on there, I'm sure they will pick up the phone and call you. Because none of these PIs, it's important, but it's also, that's a mechanism where junior faculty can get to know senior faculty. Put a patient on their trial and ask them a question. Now, don't waste their time just because you want to meet them, but ask them a question.
That's okay too. I mean, I think if you're, I mean, we all are PIs in big trials. If somebody's enrolling patients on your trial, you'd love an email from them. You'd love a chance to say hi and thanks. And so that you're 100% right. That's an opportunity, but you should, if you're a junior PI running a trial that, it's a national trial or a regional trial, larger trial, you should have the email of the overall PI. You should know who to ask, and the central coordinator or CRO, you should have their information, because they are going to be able to answer a lot of these questions that you don't know. I use those emails all the time. And
this brings up another
quickly.
point.
Yeah.
They respond very quickly, but it brings up another point that's very important. Any communication with a PI on some language that wasn't really great, there you could have read it both ways on inclusion or exclusion criteria. You want to make sure you save that, give it to your research nurse, and sits there as a source document for when or if you have an audit. Because when an auditor comes in from one of the research bases, they may read it differently than you read it. And if you've asked the question and you've gotten a response, not just from the PI, but from the research base, talking about NCTN trials, you're pretty much in the clear, okay, for an audit. But you got to save that email. If not, your team during an audit is going to be searching, how did you get clarity for here? And then you're going to be trying to actually search Outlook, which is the worst thing to ever try to search in, Outlook for an email.
Yeah. How come we haven't solved that? We'll do the next webinar on solving that problem.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So I mean, we're going, these topics are not glamorous topics, but they're so important running a trial. Next one is data safety and monitoring. Right. We're talking about ensuring patient safety. This is a part of every trial. I'll tell a brief anecdote that kind of shows just how naive I was when I started as a faculty member and wrote a trial called G minor, Genomics in Michigan Impacting Observation or Radiation. For the first manuscript from that was just published like a year ago, so it was a trial in the post prostatectomy space, and wrote the trial, and like really this was just early days learning how to do this. Eventually, I got like funding and opened the trial, multi-site trial, and literally close to a year in, got an email from the IRB like, how come we haven't heard anything from the Data Safety and Monitoring Board? And I said, what the heck is that? There had been no oversight. And you can say, well, that's not, you're like, somebody should have been able to phone it, like throw me a bone and help me and make sure there actually that process was happening, but it was not happening. And so we got a ding and then we solved it. But so this is that always sticks in my mind because this is an important topic. And maybe there's somebody out there that's like running a trial like, oh, I'm gonna learn something here. So what does this look like at your site? Like who reports? How does it happen? Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of what happens with reporting adverse events and SAEs and all that. I know, Heather, can you take this one?
Sure, yeah. I actually sit on our data safety monitoring board at our institution, so I could speak a lot to this. But every protocol has, should have, or most should have a data safety monitoring plan. And that's probably more, the exception might be observational studies where there isn't an intervention. But for interventional studies, and certainly therapeutic studies, there needs to be a data safety monitoring plan. And for IITs, for example, they often will rely on our data safety monitoring committee, which is an internal within our institution. People that are not involved directly in the research will review the adverse events, which need to be spelled out in advance, which ones will get reported. So, for example, one thing that's really important is if you're writing a protocol, is that you do want to be paying attention to safety events, adverse events, particularly grade 3 and grade 4 and grade 5, of course. Hopefully, there will not be any grade 5. Those are lethal events. But grade 1 and 2 are minor and they're very common. So you may want to write your protocol so you say we will only report 3, 4, and 5 because 1 and 2 are acceptable, and that's just going to create a lot of extra work with not a lot of, in truth, probably value unless the study is designed for quality of life and you really want to show a difference in the grade 1 and 2 events. So those are spelled out in advance of what things will be reported, and then the team has to report those. Well, it starts with the clinic visit. When you're seeing the patient, you ask the patient, have you experienced any of these side effects? Maybe there's a checklist, maybe there's some sort of routine, list, are there's certain things like, are you having hot flashes? Are you having, what's your fatigue? Those kinds of things, you can capture that in the note. And then if there's certain adverse events of special interest, for example, then you'll want to ensure that you've collected that. And then there are the serious adverse events, which are serious and need to be reported to the IRB in a timely fashion, usually 24 hours after sort of being aware. So if it's over the weekend and you have an email, if you open the email, then it's 24 hours from then. If you don't get the message until Monday, then the clock starts at the time you receive the sort of notification, but then there is a time window, and then you want to make sure that those mechanisms and your team is aware of how to kind of communicate that to the IRB. Those are things that can be helpful, again, with checklists before, as you're doing study startup and getting ready for the studies, to make sure you have that plan, the checklists for AEs and so forth. Grading.
And here's a general way to think about it. If you're a patient that you have on trial, which none of us are bone marrow transplant surgeons or bone marrow transplant doctors, so our patients are typically outpatients. All of our trials are typically outpatient. So we're not doing high dose IL-2. We're not doing stem cell transplants or CAR T. So if one of your patients on trial gets admitted to the hospital, they go to an emergency room and they get admitted, that needs to be reported really on any interventional trial. And you got 24 hours to report it from the time you find out. So if they get admitted on a Saturday night and I happen to be in Epic or whatever I'm in and I notify it's there, I got to report. We have to get that reported, and we start circulating the emails immediately. Early on, I had a patient who was on trial who got into a car accident. They were in follow-up. Still, that needs to get reported. It has nothing to do with what we were trialing, but still it needs to get reported. So you're not there to use your brain. Is this related or unrelated? Nope. They just want to make sure it's reported.
Yeah. I have a funny
Thanks,
story
yeah.
about that. I had a patient, my first patient who was on, we're going to talk about 2210 a little bit more, but it's neoadjuvant carboplatin chemotherapy before surgery for people with high risk localized prostate cancer and a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. The first patient was doing so well. He played pickleball for 4 hours and then tripped, broke his arm, and went to the ER, and that had to be reported, even though it had
Unbelievable.
nothing to do with the treatment. He was actually
Yeah,
feeling so good. He was playing pickleball. So, but yes, it does need to be reported.
unbelievable. This is great info because I mean, these are just the rules, and so if we're going to run the trials, we got to play by the rules.
But
Um,
if you think about it, there are things that we all think that we know what the side effects of the treatments that we give are ahead of times, but sometimes there are side effects that we don't know about. So if everybody's running around and falling and breaking their arm, you're only going to pick it up if they require us to report. So I
yep.
understand the reason why, but you just got to know it ahead of time.
Yeah, great point. It is. It's fair. It doesn't always seem fair at that moment. If you're looking on Saturday night, like
Yeah,
a pickleball injury, come on.
exactly.
It makes sense. All right, so this is now we get to like a little, I think, really the important stuff here, which is that we think about when we're running trials, which is sitting there talking to patients, thinking about how best we recruit patients to trials, how we can explain the trial. We're not there to be salespeople, but a lot of people come to big centers because they're interested in trials. They want state-of-the-art care, and of course, there's plenty of data to suggest that patients on clinical trials have better than average care and better than average outcomes. Um, Heather, you've already talked about this a little bit in terms of pre-screening clinics and how you in your medical oncology team approach this. Scott, you frankly are probably I mean, you're the highest accruer to many NRG trials. And I have no doubt, I think SWOG trials, I think Brian's trial, you're maybe the highest accruer to. So what's the trick? What do you guys do?
So from a screening standpoint, no one screens our clinics. So for us, we screen our own clinics. My goal in our clinic is clinical trials equals clinical care. So every patient that walks through the door, if they fit into a disease category, we will be talking to them about that trial. I don't do upper track. I don't do renal cell, but my partner, Dr. Gills, does. Our medical oncologist, Dr. Marquette, she sort of spans across all the disease sites in GU. I mainly do prostate and bladder, pretty much all I do. And so in prostate and bladder, my goal is to make sure that I have a trial open for any type of patient that comes in. A BCG naive, a BCG unresponsive by FDA definition, a BCG exposed in the muscle invasive space, the T1 very high risk LVIs, and in the prostate, same thing. And the prostate, it's castrate resistant, castrate sensitive, localized high risk disease like Heather's trial, which is excellent. And then because we know the trials, a lot of times as those new patients come in, I mean, everybody sort of pre-charts their clinic ahead of time. I know, okay, this is a patient who's potentially a candidate for these 2 or 3 trials. Um, so when I look at trials like Chapin, like Dr. Chapin's trial 1802, it actually overlaps with the CCTG trial, and the CCTG is a cooperative group trial between the Canadian Study Group and SWOG, and that's a trial that also enrolls metastatic prostate cancer patients. And so there's some overlap there. Every patient that comes in with a newly diagnosed metastatic prostate cancer, whether or not the primary is in place or not, uh, is either a candidate for this trial or they're a candidate for 1802 or both. So I'll pick up the phone, I'll call our research nurse. I said, look, this patient, Mr. Jones, who's coming in tomorrow, put a banner on top, potential 1802, potential CCTG trial. When the patient comes in, I think day one of a new diagnosis is a horrible time to start talking about this is the trial I want you to go on. I think most of these trials are standard of care plus. There's a lead in time. I think it's more important that we establish a rapport with the patient, understand what their goals, what their values are, tell them about the standard treatment plan. And sort of towards the end, I'm like, look, you may also be a candidate for a couple of clinical trials, and this is what we have available to you. And then you cultivate that. So as they come back, if they really are a candidate, you tell them more about the trial. If they ask immediately, sometimes the wives will ask, but most of the times not, then you can go ahead and go through it. I like to give patients the protocol. I actually give patients the entire protocol. I'm like, these are the two trials that we will be talking to you about. Here's the protocol. When you come back in 2 to 3 weeks to meet with me in GU Medical Oncology, we're going to go over these. And if you're a candidate, you can bring any questions and I'll also go over them with you.
Not just the consent, but the protocol,
I give them the entire protocol
which you
because
can't do on some pharma studies, correct?
yeah, there's a reason why I don't do very many pharma studies. So I actually give them the whole protocol because I think the background and how we ended up at the question is important. Okay. Every trial, the important thing is the question, what's being asked in a trial. And there are good trials and bad trials because there are good questions and bad questions. So you're right. Good for pointing that out. You can't give them a NDA'd protocol from an industry sponsor, but I like to give them the NCTN trials and get them to read it.
Heather, do you give the NCTN trials out?
I don't. I just give them the informed consent, and then if they're really, most patients, that's enough. Some patients do want to get more information, and then I'll send them references. I haven't sent them the protocol because I think that can be pretty dense, and in some cases there's privacy issues with that. But
Yeah.
I don't know if it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you what I did.
Yeah,
Or what I do.
that's super interesting. I love it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just
And everything in our clinic is on a whiteboard. So every clinic room has a whiteboard. And we literally sit there and we whiteboard their standard care of treatment. And we whiteboard, okay, this is a question that we don't know, and this is why we're doing this trial. We talk about the benefits of being on trial, the follow-up, the oversight from other institutions. There are more people than just me and our medical oncologist and our radiation oncologist that are looking at your case. Other people are looking at it nationally. So there are a lot of benefits to going on trial. I do believe that clinical trial patients do better than standard, but I also believe they're able to navigate the healthcare system better because we put resources into this. So we've got a clinical trials nurse. They have a little bit better access than the general patient to get back to us. So that's another long-winded answer.
I mean, I really love your point about taking multiple visits to walk patients through this to make sure they understand the standard of care. There's so much to cover at that first visit. They're just getting to know you. We can't always do that.
Especially,
And
well, especially on prostate cancer, Todd. Prostate cancer, you almost always have a little bit of time.
kind
Now,
of, but I want to add, I mean, think about it. We've got a slide for Heather's trial later, but let's take the neoadjuvant case. And I mean, for us, we have the GUNS trial open, which is another neoadjuvant trial, patients with very high risk prostate cancer. And I think this is a challenge for us. Patients are actually, not actually, patients are very interested in this space and interested in trials. But we do, I find, have to bring this up at that first visit. It's a lot to cover. There's all the standard of care, the complexity of the standard of care. And oh, by the way, um, if you want, first of all, have you decided on surgery? Okay, fine. Then now that we've decided on surgery, let me throw this other challenge at you, which is you can think about this complicated clinical trial and why that might, like, why we think this might be a good thing to do, but also we don't know. It's a clinical trial. It's a lot to cover in one visit. Heather, how are you guys approaching that with your trial?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said. And Scott, we don't have whiteboards in the room, but I write it out on a piece of paper. And I think it is I also agree that it's a lot at the first visit, but especially, for example, in our multidisciplinary clinic, which is we have guns open as well as 2210, is to sort of plant those seeds early. I think it's important always to sort of for the patient and to sort of know your patient and follow and just make sure it's not overly overwhelming because it's a lot to cover, but to map out the standard of care options and then anchor on top of those where the trials would fit in. So I usually have a branch point and I say surgery, radiation with ADT, and then on that backbone, so when they go home, if they're not decided yet, at least they can sort of organize to say the first decision is this one. And then once you've made that decision, then these are the options so that when they get home, there's at least some organization and we might give them the informed consent, but then they can take it home and digest it a little bit. Unfortunately, I think with guns and 2210 and others, there's hopefully, this is design considered in the design of the trial is that there's time for people to, for example, start ADT if they're feeling anxious, and then they still have some time to make the decision if they don't feel if so they don't feel rushed. I think it is really important for patients to sort of at least have these decisions be made on their own pace and have some time to digest it and talk to their family members and so forth. But I think what you said, Scott and Todd, I think that that's sort of how it's worked for me and for
Yeah.
multidisciplinary clinic.
And especially for like Heather's trial, I mean, a lot of the community that ends up referring into us, I mean, they'll show up with high risk prostate cancer, but nobody's checked their genome. Nobody knows if they have a BRCA1 or a BRCA2. So normally we're going to check that at first glance. And the way I mention Heather's trial is, look, you really need to see a radiation oncologist. You're seeing me now. We're going to go ahead and get a germline mutational analysis on you, explain what that means. And then if for some reason that germline comes back positive, which I don't hope for you, but if it does, we actually have a trial that utilizes neoadjuvant chemotherapy in that space. The likelihood that you'd be a candidate is low, but we're going to check this anyway for your trial eligibility, but also to make sure you're not carrying a gene that could impact your daughters, probably more so than your sons, but impact your family. And so that typically takes 2 weeks to come back. So there's going to be a follow-up there, especially on Heather's trial.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk like this here, I can see how you were so successful at this. I mean, that's very clear. It makes sense. And I think we could all learn a lot from how you approach this. Um, I do want to get to the next few topics, though I'd love to keep talking about that topic for another hour. But we got to measure outcomes. It's not always trivial to do this on any trial. So this is going back to that data question, but here when we're talking about the longitudinal data, the PROs, you know, radiographic response, survival, how do you guys ensure that your team's measuring these accurately? Heather?
I think we have study calendars and checklists again to sort of say, is the data, and we have a data coordination team that's separate from the in-clinic team. And so that team is basically in the chart updating all of the outcomes. And if there's questions, which sometimes there can be, because the notes aren't always, as thorough as we hope our notes are, they sometimes don't address all the issues or there's some nuances. And so they will then reach out and say, well, would you grade this as grade 1, grade 2, or, do you consider this stable disease? Or, sometimes it goes to a different adjudicator like the resist. And
Yeah,
that's a
who adjudicates resist criteria for
that's in our system, it's radiology. So there's separate, some of the radiologists have agreed that they'll be willing to do that. They may get some compensation for that separately, and they do the official resist reads.
yeah,
There are some IATs because they do cost some that for, that our internal people actually do their own resist read just by following the resist criteria. So that sometimes is done. But whatever it is just to make sure that when the scans are done, that they're done on time and that we get the sort of assessments back. And then that can help determine whether the patient continues or not. And then PROs is similar. Having study calendars and study checklists is important.
yeah, awesome.
And resist can be the most difficult thing to do in the community. Okay. Some of the worst things I need to do is when there's a kidney cancer trial and there's 2 years of scans and radiologists in the community or the imaging is done at different places. And then I have to sit there and do the resist reads and measure and confirm everything. It's horrible. So make sure if you're at a big center that you get this lined up. You can't ask a radiologist to do this for free. So there has to be some working out of compensation or however it is at your institution to make sure that you can get quality resist reads, especially if you're doing an industry trial and they're not centrally reading them. If they're centrally reading them, it doesn't matter.
Great.
Wonderful, great, then it's off your backs. But if you're responsible for the resist reads, you don't want to be the medical oncologist or the urologist sitting there measuring out lung nodules or adrenal nodules for a kidney cancer patient. That's bad move.
Truth. Yeah, I hadn't seen that. That's scary. I'm impressed that you can do that.
Thank goodness for AI teaches you a bunch.
Yeah, right. So this next topic we've talked about a little bit in some of the other webinars, but I really wanted to get your input here, which is really what makes a site desirable from a funder's standpoint or from industry standpoint, because sites are maybe tracked or ranked by CROs, by different sponsors. If we open a site or we open a trial and we put one patient on it, we said we'd put 20, it doesn't look good. Probably not going to get asked to run the next cool trial that partner might have. So how do you guys approach this? What do you think makes a site successful and attractive to funders? Scott?
Be honest, I under promise and over deliver. So if you think you look at a trial, I can put one patient a month on this trial. Tell them you can put 6. Okay. I cut the number in half. Now it drives my research team crazy because then I put 6 and they're expecting 6 and then sometimes we'll get 12. But I think you under promise when you're dealing with external sources. I think it's not the total volume of patients you put on trial, but it's also, especially for industry, probably the quality of data.
Yeah.
They'd rather a site that puts 3 patients on, the queries are answered timely, and the data is in, than a site that puts 15 patients on, and they ghost them whenever they do the queries. I think they'd rather the first site every day of the week than the second site. So you have to, and I don't have that much experience with industry. I don't work with industry much, but at least that's what I hear.
Yeah, well, I think that point's perfect because that at its core is what we're covering tonight. Like all this nitty-gritty about data quality, um, reporting, that's the quality piece of this. Yes, the don't overpromise. Um, try to be successful in the confines of what you think you can deliver and be reasonable with your estimate and hopefully get somewhere close, maybe overachieve, but the quality is so important here. All right, next piece is publications. This is the theoretical glory at the end. You run the trial, participate in the trial, but it is often a black box. Whether it's a cooperative group trial, and I mean IIT, if it's your trial, great, you've got that covered. But if it's maybe somebody else's IIT, maybe it's an industry trial. How does this work? It took me years to even like scratch the surface to understand. I still don't totally understand who gets to be an author, when, who gets to present, and when. Is it purely accruals? Scott, what's been your experience with this?
Um, I my experience is we've gotten on some big papers from an accrual standpoint. Uh, for me, I really don't give a shit about this, but I know that this does matter for a lot of people who are in academia trying to work their way up. Um, I I think
That's fair. I think a lot of people don't care necessarily. There are a lot of people probably listening to this like, this isn't the segment I care about. But as you said, there are a lot of people that are like, I mean, especially if you're a junior faculty, an
yeah.
academic center, it's important. You can pretend it's
I,
not important, but it's important.
I think if you're looking at the and I'll speak I can't speak on industry, but I'll speak to NCTN based trials. I think if you get on the team, you show you're a good partner, you show up to meetings, get to know the PIs, even if you don't accrue enough to be on somewhere in the middle for accruals, um, there are a lot of secondary papers that come out of these things. And if you show that you have an interest, somebody's going to put you on a paper. Most of the people who make it to these NCTN research based groups, most of them are actually pretty nice. They've got big names, but most of them are pretty nice. And if you approach them and you show up at meetings and you show up on the webinars and you ask questions and you pose an interesting topic, you realize a trial is about to be fully accrued and you have a question, go talk to the PI, talk to the study lead. That may be a question that they haven't thought of. And it may be a question that, although it's not going to come out in the initial publication, that may be fodder for a subsequent publication. That's all. That's all I have for that.
Yeah, well, you guys are both big names and incredibly inclusive. Um, yeah, I know a junior faculty coming up to one of you would be welcome to discuss other, offshoot papers. But Heather, what advice do you give to junior faculty, junior PI who's trying to get involved?
All of the things that Scott said, and then I think every trial, and for industry-sponsored trials, which I have also some experience with, I think it's just helpful to ask and ask early, like because sometimes there are already set rules or there's a steering committee already in place, and if you're not on the steering committee, then or a top accruer, then you may or may not be included. So understanding that is actually something our group tries to do early on when we're deciding whether even to open the trial. And so, for example, if we have multiple trials in a space that might be crowded, we will ask, well, what's the authorship opportunities for our junior faculty? And if it's unlikely, then that's something we take into account. And if it's a really large, if it's sort of balancing your portfolio includes asking and considering that. And then for NCTN trial, that may be that, certainly accrual matters, but then as Scott was saying, participation in the trial design or in subsequent analyses, even if they weren't the primary, is a good way to get involved and is kind of fun. And a lot of times, even if you're the primary PI, you may not have the bandwidth to do all the other cool analyses, and having someone who is really energetic and eager and motivated is really the fun part of it. Because a lot of what we all do, whether we're medical oncology, urology, or radiation oncology, we do hard work. It's hard to do what we do, and there's a lot of headwinds, but the fun part is when you get to work together and kind of do cool things together.
Amen.
So I think people just ask, don't be shy.
Amen. I'm curious, what's the range of responses that you get when you say when you ask about the authorship opportunities for trials? So does it range from, sorry, it's really, really unlikely that they're all accounted for, to just,
Yeah, it
get
really
some patients
depends
on
on
the
the
trial?
size of the study. So if it's a phase one trial and you get a few patients on, the likelihood is high that you'll be included as an author and that you might then go on to be able to be part of the phase two and maybe even the phase three. So if you're on early and then you're motivated and you deliver high quality data and all the things that Scott said, if you contribute on the calls, then the likelihood is high. Those trials, of course, aren't always going to be positive, but if it's a company that you can then establish a relationship and they have other portfolio, things in their portfolio, then that's a relationship that's worth cultivating. Phase two is where there's probably more sort of room maybe for negotiation. Same things true apply also, but it depends when you get involved and how long if it's already been that they've almost, the trial is completely designed and you're coming sort of as later in the game, then less likely. If you're there and part of the design discussions, then more likely. And then phase three is a little harder because usually there's a steering committee that's set up already, and those people will probably be included in the authorship. And then it's not certain, but
Yeah.
so at the phase three level, not as much, but
Yeah.
certainly NCTN and smaller trials, phase one,
And then
two.
and then everybody also needs to think about, like, NCTN trials, most of them have correlatives built in. And correlatives are typically, exploratory correlatives are typically not going to be presented unless they're built in as a secondary endpoint. Uh, they're not going to be presented with the primary paper. So really sitting down with the translational science team, making sure they know who you are, and that even if you didn't accrue enough patients to be listed in the overall publication, if your patients actually submitted their samples and those correlative papers are driven by a lot of your patients, you may be able to get on some of those publications as well.
Yep.
So correlatives are important regardless of who gets a publication, though.
Yeah, true. Okay. The last mini section here, we've referred to Heather's trial. This is Heather's trial. I want to give you a chance to discuss the setup here with the trial schema in front of us, and also just maybe you could briefly talk about how, like, when you have designed trials, how have you identified the key gaps that you want to try to tackle?
Yeah. Well, this trial has been Um, so this is SWOG 2210, targeted neoadjuvant treatment for patients with high-risk localized prostate cancer and germline DNA repair deficiency, primarily BRCA1 and 2. Neoadjuvant trial, we've talked about it a little briefly already. It's 4 cycles of carboplatin and then prostatectomy, and the endpoint is pathologic complete response. People often do not know their germline or their whether they carry a BRCA1 or 2 pathogenic variant or mutation, as Scott was saying. And so oftentimes since it's now part of NCCN guidelines to be offered testing, to have that discussion and ideally with urology, ideally when you get your pathology back, anyone with high risk localized disease is eligible or meets clinical indication for that testing to be done. Um, and that's really the front line and what drives, I think, a lot of the success of this. It's not an easy trial in the sense that we need everyone on board, and really urology is front line to be able to find out someone has that at the time they're thinking about treatment. This trial I started designing a long time ago, actually, and went through many iterations with the help of SWOG and a lot of discussions with urology to talk about feasibility for science. It went through many iterations. There were originally 5 arms of this trial. There was originally, some industry-sponsored opportunities that then later fell away because there were other industry-sponsored trials that kind of came into the picture. But then we ultimately landed on carboplatin being an inexpensive, accessible medication that is widely available in most, I mean, all medical oncologists know how to use carboplatin. It's really well tolerated and it works really, the hypothesis is it should hopefully work well for prostate cancers with BRCA1 and 2 sort of deficiencies. We know that's true for breast and ovarian cancer and pancreas cancer. So that was the hope that this would be a good fit within the cooperative group setting. So But it's a multidisciplinary approach. So we talk about this study and we talk about the gun study at our prostate multidisciplinary clinic every week. And it's really sort of I think the challenge of it is to get people tested, but the rewarding part is when we do, then, you can offer precision oncology in the very early stages, right? High risk localized disease is high risk for recurrence. So being able to offer any of our neoadjuvant trials, I think is if it's a good fit for the patient, is really satisfying and hopefully will help us learn more because of all the correlatives here and in guns and other neoadjuvant trials.
Yeah, well, this trial is a great trial. It's incredibly important. It's a challenging trial because it's such a small proportion of our patient population who's undergoing prostatectomy. But
Yeah.
these are the patients who are at really high risk of metastasis and death from prostate cancer. And so it's just a great trial. Of course, we as urologists, we're responsible for finding these patients. Huge credit to you for identifying this gap and driving this trial forward, which is immense work. That is kind of the end. We're out of time, and I did want to save 1 minute for the take-home points that maybe Scott, you could sum up for us real quick, just thinking back on this discussion.
Uh,
What are the key things for folks to take away with them?
Absolutely. You made my slide really nice. Uh, so take home points on why you do prostate cancer, why you do trials in general. If you're early on, you're still loving doing surgery or loving doing this or that, whatever your forte is. But to be honest with you, your practice will become monotonous, and trials will allow you to learn new things, and it helps break the monotony. Look for trials that are really based on your current practice. Population is important, sort of PICO-esque. Don't open trials for adrenal cancers when you don't see adrenal cancers. More importantly, maybe for industry, maybe this is why I don't do industry trials, is what's the control arm? If it's the weakest possible control arm that's out there, like an ARPI switch, frontline CRPC, is that really appropriate? You can answer that question. Interventional trials, even in something that you haven't done, they provide guide rails for novel paradigms. So for me, I never did chemoradiation in fellowship, but 1806 provided a great guide rails for us to learn how to do chemoradiation, because to that point, it only worked in Boston, is what I was told. It's really nice working across specialties. Now, my wife is our GU medical oncologist, so I do that, but it is nice building teams that are med-onc, rad-onc, uro-onc. Really, we all live, especially in academics, in different departments, in different silos. That's really not good for the patient. Patient care should be centric, and you're a bladder cancer team, you're a prostate cancer team, you're a kidney cancer team, and regardless of what your tool is, you're all going to apply those and offer those to the patient. Whiteboarding a trial is extraordinarily important. And and Heather said this earlier, and it's very important, you learn to get better at presenting a trial to the patient and yourself by doing more. And you realize, oh, we didn't realize this, so we need to change our checklist. It's a constant reassessment, which goes all the way back to the beginning, which this breaks monotony and it makes practice continually fun. You get to talk to people from all over the country that are much smarter than you. And, y'all talk about guns. In Louisiana, the only guns we know about are rifles, shotguns, and handguns. But, the opportunities that I get doing clinical trials and meeting people from across the country is great. And I wouldn't change it at all.
Oh, that was awesome. Okay. You guys are both amazing. That was such a great discussion. Cannot thank you enough. This is when I get to give out the keyword for CME. It's festive. I guess
Should have been It should have been Festivus.
Festivus. It's not Festivus. Don't try Festivus. It will not work. You will not get credit. It is festive. Thanks for participating. We really appreciate it. Again, thank you, Heather and Scott. That was really fabulous. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.